The morning my son Jason told me to leave, I had $27 in my shirt pocket and a pair of work boots with a crack along the left sole. I stood in the driveway of the house I had built with my own hands, every beam, every window frame, and looked at him. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed, looking at his feet. His wife Tiffany stood behind him, her face as cold as the October wind. "You have to go, Dad," Jason said. His voice was flat, like he was reading a grocery list. I was 67 years old. I had put 31 years into that house. I had buried my wife, a woman who was the heartbeat of every room I framed from that front porch. I asked Jason where I was supposed to go. He didn't answer. Tiffany whispered something in his ear, and he just stepped back and closed the door. The click of the deadbolt felt like a physical blow to my chest. I didn't have a car. Tiffany had organized its sale 2 weeks ago, claiming I was too old to drive. I didn't have a phone because mine had been cut from the family plan that morning. I walked to the end of the gravel driveway, the cold air smelling of wood smoke and dying leaves. I realized then that I had raised a boy who didn't know the difference between a house and a home. I wasn't just losing a roof. I was witnessing the total structural failure of my own family. I adjusted the strap of the small bag I managed to grab and started the long walk toward town. I wasn't crying. I was calculating. A carpenter doesn't panic when a wall leans. He looks for the foundation. My son thought he was throwing out a helpless old man. He forgot he was throwing out the person who taught him how to stand. The walk to the county seat took nearly an hour. Every step reminded me of the crack in my boot, letting in the damp chill of the North Carolina morning. I ended up on a bench outside the courthouse trying to think slowly. "Don't let the fear eat the logic," my father used to say. I knew my house was legally mine, or at least it should have been. I didn't understand how they could just push me out. A woman from the clerk's office came out for lunch and sat on the other end of the bench. She looked at my boots, then my face. She didn't ask if I was homeless. She asked if I'd had a rough morning. I told her I'd just been decommissioned from my own life. She handed me half of her turkey sandwich mustard on wheat and told me not to argue. As I ate, she mentioned an estate auction happening the next morning on Route 9. An old fishing cabin on a 1/4 acre was being sold off by the county. "It's a wreck," she said, "but it's a direction to walk in." I thanked her, feeling the first spark of a plan. I spent that night under the park pavilion, huddled in a jacket my wife had given me for my 55th birthday. I watched the stars and made a list. I had $27. I had my health, and I had a reputation in this town that Jason and Tiffany hadn't yet managed to tarnish. I wasn't going to a shelter. I was going to a job site. The cabin wasn't a tragedy. It was my next project. When the sun finally started to peek over the horizon, I wasn't tired. I was ready. I walked to the auction with my head held high, looking every bit like the man who had built half the barns in this county. The auction was at 9 sharp. There were about 10 people standing in the cold, mostly looking for scrapland. When we got to the cabin, the generous term for it would have been a shed. The porch had caved, the windows were boarded with rotting plywood, and the roof had lost its fight with the last 3 winters. But I saw the bones. It was timber framed with a hand-laid stone foundation. Stone foundations last forever if you respect them. The bidding started at $50. Nobody moved. The auctioneer looked around, frustrated. A guy in the back bid $30, then saw a raccoon run through a hole in the wall and retracted it. The auctioneer sighed. "Anyone, anything." I stepped forward and held up my crumpled bills. $27, I said. "It's every cent I have in the world." The auctioneer was an old man I'd done kitchen cabinets for back in the 90s. He looked at the cabin, then at me. He didn't see a beggar. He saw a master craftsman. "Sold," he barked, slamming the gavel. The $27 covered the filing fee exactly. The county just wanted it off the books. I walked onto that rotting porch and didn't feel despair. I felt ownership. I went straight to the hardware store. Dale, the owner, had known me for decades. I didn't ask for a loan. I told him the truth. I told him I needed a pry bar, a hammer, and a saw, and I'd pay him back in labor. Dale looked at my hands, calloused and steady, and handed me a bag of mixed nails and an old refurbished saw. "Start with the porch, Arthur," he said. "The rest will follow." I hauled the tools back to my new home on my shoulder, the weight feeling more natural than the silence of the house I'd just been kicked out of. For the next 2 weeks, my life was the rhythm of the hammer. I woke up at dawn in a sleeping bag Dale's wife had dropped off, and I worked until my vision blurred. I lived on dried beans, coffee, and the few jars of preserved green beans I found in the cabin's crawl space. The raccoons in the ceiling were my only roommates. I repaired the porch support first, jacking up the roof with a fallen log and a lot of prayer. I replaced the split copper pipes with PVCI salvaged from a demolition site 3 miles down the road. The owner let me take whatever I could carry in exchange for 3 days of sorting scrap metal. By the end of the second week, I had a working wood stove and a hand pump that gave me clear, cold water. My son didn't know where I was. He hadn't called the police or checked the hospitals, which hurt more than the hunger. But the town was talking. People started driving by Route 9 just to see the old carpenter, bringing the old Kelly place back to life. One afternoon, a man from the county recorder's office stopped by. He was a friend of Dale's. He sat on my newly repaired porch and told me something that turned my blood to ice. He'd seen a deed transfer on my old house 6 months ago. It had been transferred from my name to Tiffany's name. He said my signature was on the paper witnessed by a notary I'd never met. I sat there holding a wood plane and felt the final piece of the betrayal click into place. It wasn't just a whim, it was a heist. My son hadn't just kicked me out. He'd helped his wife steal my legacy. The news of the forged deed changed my focus. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building a case. I contacted a young lawyer through a legal aid clinic, a man named David, who had more fire than experience. He came out to the cabin, stepping carefully over my vegetable patch. He looked at the work I'd done and his eyes widened. "You did this alone?" he asked. I told him that when you know how a house is built, you know how to take it apart too. I gave him the dates, the weeks Tiffany had kept me rested in my room, the insurance papers she'd tried to get me to sign, and the fact that I hadn't left the property for a notary appointment in 3 years. David took notes on a yellow pad, his pen flying. He told me that Tiffany had a history. She'd done this to a neighbor 2 towns over, but the man had passed away before it went to court. "She's a predator, Arthur," David said. "And she thinks you're the prey because you're 67. While David worked the legal angle, I kept working the wood. I built a kitchen shelf out of reclaimed oak that was so beautiful it made me cry when the sun hit it. I wasn't just fixing a cabin, I was reclaiming my identity. I realized that Jason and Tiffany had tried to erase me. They thought that by taking my house they took my value, but value isn't in a deed. It's in the ability to create something from nothing. I planted garlic along the south wall. It's a promise to the future. You plant it in the fall, and it doesn't come up until spring. It meant I intended to be there to see it. I was no longer a victim waiting for a miracle. I was a homeowner waiting for a court date. In November, a familiar truck pulled into my dirt drive. It was Jason. He climbed out, looking older and more tired than I remembered. He stood there staring at the cabin, the gleaming porch, the repaired roof, the smoke curling from the chimney. He didn't look happy. He looked ashamed. I didn't get up from my rocking chair. I just watched him. "People in town are talking, Dad," he said, his voice cracking. "They're saying you're living in a shack." I told him it wasn't a shack. It was a structure built on honesty, which was more than I could say for the house he was living in. He tried to tell me he didn't know about the deed transfer, that Tiffany told him it was all standard estate planning. I looked him in the eye and asked him if he really believed that, or if he just found it easier to let her lie so he didn't have to take care of his father. He put his head in his hands and cried. It was the same cry he had when he was 6 and broke a neighbor's window, but he wasn't 6 anymore. I didn't comfort him. I poured him a cup of coffee and told him about the recording. David and I had obtained a recording of Tiffany bragging to a friend about how easy it was to swap the pages in my insurance folder. Jason's face went pale. He realized then that the woman he'd chosen was a criminal, and he was her accomplice. I told him he had one chance to make it right. He could tell the truth to the DA, or he could lose his father and his freedom at the same time. He left without another word, the sound of his tires on the gravel sounding like a retreat. The legal battle was slow, but the evidence was overwhelming. David found the notary a cousin of Tiffany's, who had a gambling problem and a loose relationship with the law. Once the threat of jail time was on the table, the notary folded like a cheap lawn chair. He admitted he'd never even met me. The DA moved quickly after that. Tiffany was charged with deed fraud and elder exploitation. The story hit the local paper, and suddenly the helpless man in the cabin was the talk of the county. Neighbors who had stayed quiet out of politeness started coming by with pies, lumber, and apologies. I didn't want their pity. I wanted their respect. I spent the winter hunkered down by my wood stove reading law books and refining my cabin. Jason had moved into a small apartment after the police served a search warrant on our old house. He was cooperating, providing emails and documents that showed Tiffany's long-term plan to isolate me and drain my pension. It was a cold, lonely winter, but I felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't living under someone else's expectations. I wasn't the difficult father-in-law or the burden. I was Arthur the Builder. I spent my evenings carving small wooden figures for the neighbor children, using the scraps of oak from my shelves. I learned that you can survive on very little if your heart is full of purpose. The $27 I'd spent at the auction was the best investment I'd ever made. It bought me a house, yes, but it also bought me my soul back. I was no longer waiting for life to happen to me. I was the one making it happen. February brought the final court hearing. I wore my best work shirt and my cracked boots, which I'd since repaired with a sturdy leather patch. I sat in the front row as the judge read the verdict. The deed transfer was invalidated. My house was returned to my name. Tiffany was sentenced to 3 years of probation and significant restitution, her reputation in the community shattered. Jason wasn't charged, but the judge gave him a stern lecture on the responsibilities of a son. After the hearing, Jason approached me in the hallway. He asked when I was moving back into the big house. I looked at him and realized I didn't want to. That house was full of ghosts. The ghost of my wife, the ghost of the son I thought I had, and the smell of Tiffany's perfume. The cabin, however, smelled like cedar and hard work. I told him I'd be renting the big house to a young family who needed a start. The rent will pay my taxes and keep me in lumber, I said. Jason looked confused. He couldn't understand why I'd choose 400 square feet over 3,000. I explained to him that a house is just a box. What matters is what you do inside it. I told him he could come visit me at the cabin on Sundays, provided he brought his own coffee and a willingness to work in the garden. He nodded, finally looking me in the eye. He was starting to learn that forgiveness isn't a gift you get. It's a structure you build one brick at a time. I walked out of that courthouse and didn't look back at the big house on the hill. I headed toward Route 9, toward the creek and the garlic that was just starting to poke through the soil. Spring arrived with a burst of green and a new way of living. I had moved my favorite rocking chair to the east window of the cabin, where I could watch the creek. The young family had moved into the old house, and the sound of children playing in the yard made the property feel alive again. They paid a modest rent, and in return, I showed the father how to fix the leaky faucets and prune the rose bushes. We had a trade going. He'd bring me fresh eggs and help me haul heavy logs, and I'd teach him the secrets of the trade. My son Jason started coming over on Sundays. At first it was awkward. We'd sit in silence listening to the wood stove. But slowly we started talking about ordinary things, the weather, the garden, the town news. He started helping me build a second small cabin on the property, a guest house for when his daughter, my granddaughter, came to stay. He wasn't the same man who had closed the door on me in October. He was humbler, more aware of the world around him. He told me he was glad I didn't move back. "This place fits you, Dad," he said one afternoon while we were framing the new walls. "It's solid." I realized that by not being cruel to him, by not cutting him out entirely, I had given him the chance to rebuild himself. Justice wasn't just about winning the house back. It was about restoring the balance of our lives. I was no longer the victim, and he was no longer the villain. We were just two people trying to build something that would last. I am 68 now. My boots are still the same ones I wore that October morning. Though they've been patched so many times, they're more thread than leather. I stand on my porch every morning and look at the $27 investment that saved my life. People often ask me if I'm angry about what happened. I tell them that anger is like rot in a floor joist. If you leave it there, the whole thing eventually collapses. I chose to cut the rot out and replace it with something stronger. I've learned that life isn't about the things you own, but the things you can do with your hands and your heart. I have a small house, a clean creek, and a son who finally knows the value of his father. I have $27 in my pocket again today, but this time it's not all I have. It's just change. My true wealth is the knowledge that I can face the cold and the dark and come out the other side with a hammer in my hand. To anyone standing at the end of a driveway today with nowhere to go, I tell you this. Don't look at the closed door. Look at the ground at your feet. Check the foundation. Find a tool. You don't need a fortune to start over. You just need the courage to pick up the first piece of wood. Trust is a structure just like a house. You build it one joint at a time, checking for level, making sure it's square. It takes time, and sometimes it hurts your back. But when the storm comes, you'll be glad you did the work. My name is Arthur. I am a carpenter, and I am exactly where I am supposed to be.